Is China determined to reign over the Asia-Pacific region? Dubbed as the biggest bully right now in the region, China's current standoff with the Philippine government and territorial and sovereignty issues shows that it has no qualms in pressing its might and power over their claims based, according to them, on historical and even geographical perspectives. Sa agresibong pamumusturan ng China sa rehiyon ng Asia-Pasipiko, ang tunay nga bang tinatapatan nila o nito bilang isang superpower ay walang iba kundi ang Estados Unidos o ang Amerika. Ang Estados Unidos sa kabila ng matagal ng panahong pagkakaalis sa Pilipinas sa mga base militar nito ay nanatili ang interes sa Asia-Pasipiko. Ano ba talaga ang issue dito? What is really at stake here? Is it really a contest of dominance between China and other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, or is it a contest of power between China and the United States of America? Ngayong gabi, himayin natin ang usapin ng patuloy na tensyon sa Scarborough Shoal at sa West Philippine Sea. Ngayon ay ika-20 sa buwan ng Hulyo taong 2012. Itanong, isiwala at ibalita. Ito ang Ibalita Online. Ako si Arlene de la Cruz. Nagbabalik ang Ibalita Online. Ang mga bansang kasapi ng Association of Southeast Asian Nations o ASEAN ay hindi nakapagpalabas ng joint statement tungkol sa lumalawak at hindi na may tatangging pamamayani ng pwersa ng China sa mga karagatan sa South China Sea at sa West Philippine Sea o sa teritoryong sakop ng China Sea at ng West Philippine Sea. Ito ang kauna-unahang pagkakataon na hindi nakapagpalabas ng joint statement o communique ang ASEAN, lalo na sa usaping kabilang o ang pinatutungkulan ay ang China. Jel Miranda with the report.
Ang tumataas na presensya ng China sa mga karagatang nasa South China Sea o West Philippine Sea ay isang usapin na hindi na matalikuran ng mga bansang kasapi ng ASEAN o ng Southeast Asian nations. Ngunit sa kabila nito, sa kauna-unahang pagkakataon sa halos 50 taon ng kasaysayan ng ASEAN, hindi ito nakapagpalabas ng joint statement o communique nang ang usapin ay patungkol na sa mga hakbang ng China sa South China Sea. Ngunit sa kabila nito, sinabi ng Foreign Minister ng Indonesia na sisikapin pa rin ng mga bansang kasapi ng ASEAN na makapagpalabas ng statement tungkol dito.
That Indonesia has been carrying out over the past 36 hours. It is fair to describe it as being an intensive shuttle diplomacy effort, an intensive working the phone effort, to the purpose of which to once again restore or to reiterate what is a statement of fact. That statement of fact is ASEAN continues, remains to be united, to be cohesive on all issues of its common concern, and not least and especially on the issue of the South China Sea.
Dahil sa hindi pagpapalabas ng joint statement sa usapin ng agresibong mga hakbang ng China sa South China Sea o sa West Philippine Sea, ang reputasyon ng ASEAN ay nalagyan ng kwestiyon sa halos kalahating siglo ng pag-iral nito. Ang ASEAN ay kinabibilangan ng mga bansang Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam at ng Pilipinas. Para sa Ibalita Online, ako si Jel Miranda.
Sa pagbabalik ng Ibalita Online, makasama natin si Professor Huang Jing. Professor Huang Jing is an expert on Asia-Pacific security and other political issues, and he is from the National University of Singapore. Professor Huang Jing is here in the country discussing the standoff, and he will join us right after this break for Ibalita Online. Nagbabalik ang Ibalita Online. Ng standoff sa pagitan ng China at ng Pilipinas ay halos 4 na buwan na. Nagsimula ito April 18, pero hanggang ngayon, sa halip na ito ay humupa, lalong lumalala ang sitwasyon at mukhang determinado ang China na talagang ituloy ang kanilang dominance sa naturang area ng Asia-Pacific region. Para po talakayin yan, kausama natin ngayon. With me is Professor Huang Jing from the Center on Asia and Globalization. He is also a professor in the National University of Singapore. Professor Huang, good evening.
Good evening, Anna.
First, the question is, what is really at stake here? How do we understand the situation? The Philippines calls it attention. Of course, we have filed diplomatic protest on the Philippine side, but China seems to be insisting on its dominance. How do we view the issue?
I think that it's because China always see that this is a part of China, and Chinese government make it very clear that regarding the territory issue is a core interest. So it is very difficult for China to back down, especially when nationalism is rising in China. But on the other hand, of course, Filipinos are also determined to protect their interest and their territory. So therefore, the two sides seems to be at the issue that neither side can afford to back down. That's why the tension has been lingering and the crisis is being there.
But the question is, why now? Why suddenly China is so assertive, so aggressive of its
three reasons.
claim in,
Yeah,
in the West Philippine Sea?
Number one, of course, just like I said, China has a rising nationalism, and also we know that is a leadership transition going on in China. So during this kind of period, Chinese leadership has to behave strong and tough, because they're in a very fierce struggle at home. And secondly, that China seems to have the capability to go that far to manage the so-called South China Sea, which China claims to be its territory. But last but not the least, I believe, is the American strong intervention in the area, which seems to embolden the small countries to stand up towards China's claim. And that's why it's all happened in the past 2 years.
Are you saying that the real contest here is the dominance of China in strategic areas in the Asia-Pacific region against not countries in the Asia-Pacific region, but the United States of America?
Yeah, to a certain extent that's true, because can you imagine if China is not strong enough, things will not happen. And if United States will not take up the issue with the Chinese, it will not happen. So basically it happened just like I said, when the United States made a very powerful return, so-called pivot on Asia, and on the other hand, China is rising up. So the two big powers collapse, or not collapse, clash. Clashing in the
collide,
area. And they collide in the area, and of course countries like Philippines have to behave very carefully, otherwise it will be caught in between.
So how important is the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea strategically from the perspective of the Chinese government?
Number one, of course, is nationalism, national pride, and the confidence. And China feels this is if I cannot even protect my own interests, then how can the Chinese feel, how can they become a citizen of big power? And second, of course, is the economic interests. There's a lot of fish there, and the gas, oil, resources. And number three is the national security interests. China is a big country, does not feel safe until you have some control of the South China Sea, if you look at the map. And the last but not the least is for China's future development, because we know that all the countries have to have certain control of the ocean. And so that's why South China Sea is a gateway for China to push into the blue water.
Of course, the Philippines has its sovereign right to pursue its diplomatic protests and claims over the area. But based on historical perspective, you told me earlier that you're a Chinese American. Is the claim really true historically on the perspective of China that they really own part of that area in the West Philippine Sea?
We have to say that the concept of territory, the concept of sovereignty is a modern product. Before the Western intrusions, and people come and go in that area, and nobody claims this is mine or yours, so that the so-called historical background or historical base for the claim, I don't think it holds water. And because
how's that again? You don't think it holds water?
It holds water. I mean, I don't think it stands. But on the other hand, we know that it is the Westerners who came to these areas about a couple hundred years ago.
The divide.
They began to they brought in the Western ideas of territory, because nation-state building is a recent set. And what makes the sense even more important is when during the World War II, the Japanese occupied the entire area, make South China Sea Japanese lake. And at that time, China, of course, fighting very hard against Japan, realized how important the control of the ocean really is. So after Japan surrendered, the KMT, that is the Republic of China at that time in mainland China, immediately inherited all the claims made by the Japanese, that is South China Sea. And of course, when Communist Party of China came to power in 1949, they inherited this claim from the Republic of China, which now is in Taiwan. So if you talk about history, that's a history, and not very, very far beyond the current time.
What about the present concept of baseline territory, which they're insisting they have the historical and legal right of claimantship?
I think right now, all the claim for baseline or international law or history, I think that's just a kind of justification.
Okay.
What really matters is the national interests economic interest, and what really matters is the rise of a global power like China, and which is determined to hold its control in this area because it truly believes it belongs to China. Of course, when you're dealing with a big power, international laws or histories, all of this can be used as justification, but I don't think that's real. The real reason behind China's claim.
Help us understand the point of view of the ordinary Chinese, because you say this is an issue of nationalism on the part of China because of the change and transition of leadership. But we're talking of a government that is basically still communist. How important is the push for nationalism, and is there really a rising clamor or real clamor about sovereignty in these areas? Please answer that question right after this break. Ang Ibalita Online ay magbabalik ilang saglit lamang. Nagbabalik ang Ibalita Online. With me is Professor Wang Jing of the Center on Asia and Globalization, and he is also from the National University of Singapore. Professor Wang Jing, or Wang, should I say?
Wang, yeah.
The question that I asked earlier before the break was that help us understand the concept of nationalism of the Chinese, the people of China, because basically, as I said, it's still a government that is under communism, and we in the Philippines is under democracy. The sentiment of nationalism is, I must say, very easy to understand in a concept of democracy. But what about in the concept or in the perspective of people under communism?
I think right now, first, communism as an idea in China dead already, because China is very much capitalized. Market forces, there more capitalism than any other countries. But in terms of nationalism, I think Filipinos and the Chinese are coming from the same background, so it's easy to understand. Because like Filipinos, China suffered hundreds of years of Western intrusions under the imperialist power. You know, ever since a war we called Opium War in 1840, you know, the British, you know, move all the opium to China. China become opium dealers, and when China rose up, said, "Look, we don't want any opium anymore," and then they put a war on China. So China suffered huge injustice and humiliation, defeat again and again for over 100 years. So finally, after a very bloody war for, they call it revolution, but here you call it independence, China finally become an independent country. So therefore, there is very strong nationalism based on this kind of national experience, that no more, China will never go back to 1840 to be bullied and pushed around by the Western powers. Therefore, when the South China Sea came back, especially when the South China Sea became an issue because United States want to return, and Chinese people, ordinary people, have a strong feeling that no more, you did this to me yesterday, not today. I'm not going to let 1 inch of land to be taken by foreigners. So this kind of very strong nationalistic resentment has been get into this area. So as a result, for the Chinese leaders, it's more difficult to manage the internal nationalist sentiment than to manage the countries has a dispute with the Philippines. So it's just like Philippines. The major problem, ironically, in this issue is not external, it's internal.
It's internal.
Yes.
You mentioned that China's sentiment is that never to be bullied again by another foreign power or Western power. But they are bullying countries in Asia-Pacific region, the Philippines, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's where the tragedy is, that is when a big power was bullied before, when it became a big power itself, it should become more sensitive on those issues.
Exactly.
But now here, it matters the issue of the sovereignty, and exactly because that issue, and the Chinese government as well as the Chinese population, Chinese people become extremely sensitive. Because from China's perspective, as you can understand, that Philippines will not have a problem with us except when being provoked or supported by the big power, mighty Americans. So in this regard, China's strong reaction on this issue is not necessarily against
the Philippines,
but against Americans, because they know that if we let the Philippines get what they want with American support, then next day will be Malaysia, India, or Vietnam, so on and so forth. Whoever can have Americans' blessing can have a bite on us, then we cannot afford that. So in reality, although it seems it's a big China bully in the Philippines, but from China's point of view, especially ordinary Chinese, it is a kind of struggle standing up against Americans. So that's
So
why the Philippines
it's a
caught
question
in
of
between.
perspective and orientation of the issue.
And also national pride.
National pride.
And but the real issue, of course, from policymakers' point of view, is also a question about national interests.
How do you solve the stand-up then? It's been running 4 months. Should the United Nations say something about this? Should a third country interfere?
But China's position is always very clear. It will against internationalization of the issue. It will against any other country to intervene. So the issue is number one: will United Nations pick up the case? After 4 months, we did not see United States making, or the United Nations, I'm sorry.
Not even lifting a finger.
Not even make sense. They don't even want to look at this way. And any third party want to intervene, will have to consider China factor first. But on the other hand, after 4 months of tension, still we did not see things getting worse. Actually, if you look at it, it's getting more and more stable. I think that's stabilized. I think that's a good news. In other words, as long as we do not provoke a war between the Chinese and the Filipinos, then we should feel lucky. And personally, I believe both sides, I mean China side and the Filipino side, will have a strong incentive to solve this issue peacefully and even quietly. Because after all, I do not believe this issue should be solved by war, by a fight, by war, because a war is a disaster for both China and the Philippines. You're going to say, China is such a big country, it's surely going to win. Why China will suffer? Because China can win the battle, but China will forever lose the image of a peaceful power, and also China as a big country will lose the moral high ground, which is extremely important for China to sustain its development.
So, my last question, Professor, is should a dialogue, at least focused on this issue, be done immediately on the highest level from the Chinese government and the Philippine government, just the two countries, and no intervention, like, for example, from America and other, not even from the United Nations?
I believe that it should. And as a matter of fact, I think that they already are talking to each other. And we know that after 3 years, Philippines eventually sent an ambassador to China. And my knowledge told me that, my information told me that the Chinese and Filipinos already engage each other secretly. By doing this, I think two sides have to restrain themselves. Number one, do not make any provocative public statement to spoil party. Number two, yes, indeed, do not escalate the tension. So both sides have to restrain themselves. So provide a very good environment for the quiet diplomacy to make some success for all of us.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
you
you.
for your time. Thank you for your
Pleasure.
time. Professor Wang Jing of the Center on Asia and Globalization is also with the National University of Singapore. He joined us tonight here on Ibalita Online discussing the tension that remains high in the West Philippine Sea and the Scarborough Shoal. Magbabalik ang Ibalita Online nilang saglit lamang. Nagbabalik ang Ibalita Online kung perspektiba ng China at ang Pilipinas sa pag-uusahan. Pareho lamang ang tinitindigan nito pagdating sa territorial and sovereign claim sa West Philippine Sea o maging sa Scarborough Shoal. At yan, yung tumataas na nationalist sentiment. Kaya sumasang-ayon kami sa sinabi ni Professor Wang Jing ng Center on Asia and Globalization na ang kailangan dito ay mas ipagpatuloy pa at pagtibayin, palawakin ang pag-uusap sa pagitan ng dalawang bansa. Sabi ni Professor Jing, lalala lamang ang sitwasyon kung ang ibang bansa, lalo na anila ang Estados Unidos na hindi raw may tatangging meron pa ring strategic claim sa naturang lugar o may interes sa naturang lugar sa Asia-Pasipiko, ay papagitna sa usapin na anya ay maaring pataas talaga ng tensyon sa ngayon ay nananatiling standoff sa pagitan ng China at ng Pilipinas. Continue the dialogue according to Professor Wang Jing, and the least intervention from any other countries that would at least not actually resolve but maintain the peace in the disputed region or territory in the West Philippine Sea and Scarborough Shoal. Ang Pangulo po ay magbibigay ng kanyang State of the Nation address at maraming nagtatanong sa Lunes ba, magiging bahagi ba ito ng kanyang talumpati? May mga nagpapayo sa kanya na wag nang magsalita tungkol dito. At ang sabi rin po ni Professor JING, kailangan din maging mahinahon ang dalawang bansa at wag mag-issue ng mga provocative statement na lalong maaring makadagdag sa tensyong nananatili sa naturang rehiyon sa Asia-Pasifiko. Itanong, isiwalat, ibalita. Itong Ibalita Online. Ako si Arlene de la Cruz.